There you
right.
go. So we're picking up where we left off pretty much. And that's on 11A3, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we had a number of midrashic explanations, sort of like they're not meant to be a real theory of what the word, the name comes from, the name Achashverosh, but they are kind of like associations to make the name connect up with feelings that some of the sages had about who he was. And one of the things that we noticed was that it's uniformly negative, right? And that's part of what we've noticed in general in these discussions as we've gone through these midrashim, that we usually have a kind of a sort of a mixed feelings about Achashverosh. Haman is the bad guy, and Achashverosh is his foolish foil. He's manipulated by him. Then he's manipulated by Esther to be a force for good. So he likes, he's the swing vote that just you can't predict exactly where he's going to go. But from the statements that we've had again and again and again, they all see Achashverosh as being responsible for his actions, and that he actually is not the best guy in the world, right? And we're at, I think the Megillah continues, so it's the right-hand column, 11A3, toward the bottom half of that column. Yes?
Yep.
Good, thank you. So who's going to read for us today? Come on, going once, going twice.
Here I am.
All right, yay. Thank you.
Once again, into the breach.
So where it says the Megillah continues, let's understand that we're sort of trying to move along in the text of the Megillah. And we've discussed already the first phrase, Vayihi bimei Achashverosh. And it happened in the days of Achashverosh. That's the first words. We've talked about that a few times. And now, if we continue reading that verse, it says, Vayihi bimei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh. This is Achashverosh. He was Achashverosh. So the implicit question is, why the repetition? What's this extra mentioning of him? And he is who Achashverosh. What is that all about? So here we go. The Megillah continues.
The Megillah continues. Who Achashverosh? That is Achashverosh. This teaches that Achashverosh remained in his wicked ways from beginning to end.
Okay, so he stayed in his wickedness from start to finish, and that should raise an eyebrow or two for us, right? Why should it sound a little objectionable to say that?
Well, he wasn't wicked all the way through. He did things that would have resulted in great wickedness had they gone ahead. But he was persuaded by Esther to not to reverse them. Apparently, that was impossible in Persia, but to allow for the Jews to counter that evil. He first encouraged bad, and then he wound up encouraging something that was good.
Right, exactly. By the end of the story of the Megillah, he's got Mordechai as his advisor instead of Haman. Esther is his recognized Jewish queen, and she's still the queen, not like Vashti who got deposed. So by the end of the story, he sounds like he's mended his ways. So here we have a claim, don't believe it. Don't believe it. In the end, he's wicked through and through. Go ahead.
Further examples of this form of interpretation. The verse, that is Esau, teaches that Esau remained in his wicked ways from beginning to end.
Okay.
The verse that is Dasan and Aviram teaches that Datan and Aviram remained in their wicked ways from beginning to end.
Right, Datan
verse
and
that-
Aviram. So Esav is famous. Datan and Aviram is this last Torah reading that we just had on Shabbos.
Yeah.
Right? These are the other ringleaders to challenge Moshe and Aaron, and unrepentant, right? Evil through and through. So we've got a number of arch villains here, according to this perspective. Achashverosh is up there with Esav, who of course we've talked about many times, but from this rabbinic perspective, he represents evil, and he's a bad guy. And Datan and Aviram, who are the clearest of the bad guys, because they really lace into Moses. We talked a little bit about that in Torah study this past week. And they're destroyed by God because they're evil. So they're the clearest ones. Esav is an ambiguous figure. We've talked about that many times. And yet here the claim is, no, don't be fooled. And now we're having Achashverosh being put into this really bad company, where we would think that Achashverosh should be seen as much less of a problematic figure, and yet this is saying, underneath it all, he was totally evil. Whatever he did that was good was simply his calculation of what was good for him at this particular moment, but not because of any particular goodness that's in him. Jen, you wanted to say something?
Just does it seem like some of our sages really are uncomfortable with moral ambiguity?
I think that's not accurate. I think that the sages talk about moral ambiguity all the time. I think that
Do they need supervillains then? I mean, they just need to pick
they are
a few?
convinced about that there's a reality of evil and that there is villainy out there. Certainly some of these, the voice that we're hearing now is a voice that says that this person is not morally ambiguous, but on the contrary, he's like I say, essentially he's a bad guy. He may do a couple of good things, and there's no vouchsafing that if he allows the Jewish people to be saved, that's good. But in the end, he's a bad guy. I don't want to say that they're incapable of moral ambiguity. Maybe in a certain sense that what they're saying is that is the moral ambiguity. Maybe it's not accepting moral ambiguity, when we say, oh, look at that, Achashverosh turned into a good guy. He did this good thing at the end, so now he's a good guy. Yeah.
From what we have in our scripture, I don't know the historic person, but from Esther, it just seems like, he's going to be influenced by whoever he's influenced at the moment. It seems like he doesn't have enough, like we don't know him well enough to say how good or evil he is, because he just goes with whatever happens to strike him at the moment.
So
I don't know if that's the same thing as being evil.
I think that's an accurate statement of the way we would read it. And I guess what they're pushing is to say that anybody that can go any way they want, in the end, that's evil. In other words, if somebody wants to exterminate a people and they're willing to pay me $10,000 to do it, all right, I'll let them. Oh, now the other person is arguing and persuading me that that's not such a good idea. It's not in my interest to destroy these people. Okay, I'll save the people.
That's probably more an argument against absolute power.
Well, that's an abstraction. People exercise power, and people make choices about how they exercise power. And I think that's where moral ambiguity actually factors in. It's about what kind of person are you when you have the opportunity to use power. So yeah, I think it's very tricky. I think that clearly they are conditioned, they're influenced, the rabbis, by their own view of what's been going on in Jewish history. But they're also, I think, raising actually a very serious question about how we judge people. And I think that I would say the opposite. I would say the ambiguity is increased by what they're saying.
I
Now,
would say
what
that
I have,
for
what,
Esau,
let me
like,
just finish one more, again, one more kind of easy, maybe again, unfair example. Because these kinds of examples are always very tricky. What do you do with a Nazi that does something good? Right? So, you know,
I find that very difficult. Are you talking about someone who was a guard? What were they
right,
doing?
right,
as a
right. So that's
Nazi?
why I don't want to push it too hard.
Like somebody who just
Right.
joined the party because,
Right. But so here, Achashverosh is a ruler. So he's not just a particular, you know, camp guard or even a camp commandant, but even a camp commandant, a person who has power, like you say, person who has power and is willing to use that power to destroy people. But then for this particular moment, he says, no, you know what, I'll let you off. You know, what you know, so that's what they're saying. Oh, so does that change everything? Now, all of a sudden, from being a dark figure, he becomes a figure of light?
well,
No.
they're willing to let David be morally ambiguous, right? Or a super good guy. Asaph, who I think they only dislike him because they associate him with later with other countries and stuff. It's like I don't see anything in the Torah that makes Asaph this terrible
Correct.
person.
So again, I agree with you on that, on the face of it. I want to just remind all of us that they knew the Torah just as well as we do, and they knew how to read the Torah in many, many ways. And yes, when they're bringing up that perspective, they are bringing up that perspective and saying, we're not interested in Esav actually as a personality in a novel. We're interested in Esav as a world historical individual and as a force that affected Jewish destiny. So yes, of course, they're putting aside their sense of Esav as a flesh and blood, unique individual who only, you know, existed at that particular moment in that particular place. They're talking about Esav as an archetype. So, and that's what their, you know, that's what their message is about. Their message is about, we're looking at this stuff through the lens of national survival and international relations on a moral plane. So and that's the challenge that they keep putting up. This is, I mean, these are, I'm not trying to, again, I'm not poo-pooing what you're saying, but I'm not poo-pooing what they're saying. That's where I feel that the complexity is around in all of this. You know, to take a really fraught example for me today. How do we deal with all these actors in American society, in Europe, in Israel, who are, you know, going back and forth with you know, doing all kinds of things? How do we deal with anti-Semitism? How do we deal with silence on the part of people that we want to be our allies, and who we feel that we've been allies for and with? You know, when we don't hear the ambiguity or the complexity being acknowledged, when it all gets one way, what does that say? What does that say? And I struggle with this. As everybody knows here, I'm deeply committed to, you know, 99% of the causes of the left and of the solid left, not just center left. But I struggle with a lot of what goes on the left as a, you know, in this kind of like moral blindness, when it becomes, and again, I please don't take this, you know, as directed at you, but when the analysis is just power related, the left is very invested in that. The left is very invested in,
yeah, because they feel they can punch up with Jews and they punch down on anybody else.
right. But in just,
I mean,
first
same
I'm
thing with
making a
Indians.
general statement that the left is, you know, and it made a contribution. The whole consciousness that we now have of who's got the power, how do you use power? Powerful people too often use their power despicably. But that becomes a simplification, and then it becomes power is bad, powerful people are all bad, powerless people are all good.
But I'm the one who's saying Achashverosh, let's not judge him right away. I'm saying there's a
No,
big
I know,
problem.
but it goes back
power,
and forth. What I'm saying is there are many kinds of power. Achashverosh has an obvious political power. He's the emperor of a worldwide empire at the time. But there are all kinds of power. There's media power. There's even moral power.
Oh yeah, I get caught up in this because the pride parades that don't want Jewish stars. I mean, it's like ridiculous.
So if Achashverosh is being called for how he uses his power in a kind of like wishy-washy or flipping way or unreliable way, then what does that say for all of us in the way that we use our power? And when can we be counted on? And when do we have principles that we say, you know what, this is non-negotiable? And when do we say, no, but my calculation is that, you know what, I'm not going to stand up for this because I've got this other thing that I feel I want to accomplish. So, you know, like you say, I can, the Jews are strong enough. They can take a few casualties. You know, it's not, as one person once said, and I'm totally appalled and I totally condemn what Israel does 99.99999% of the time in its relations with the Palestinians and with the Arab world. But on the other hand, there's some real truth to saying the reason that the world is against Israel is because not enough Jews were killed by Hamas. You know, if there were thousands of rockets were shot at Israel, if they actually had killed a few thousand Jews, then maybe the world would start saying, you know what, we can feel your pain. But nebuch, only a few Jews got killed, so you can afford it. You know, there's something despicable about that. So to call it out, what they're saying for Achashverosh is you don't get a free pass just because in the end you were seduced by your queen to let Jews defend themselves.
That's fine, but somebody should say, well, put yourself in absolute power and, as you are now. I mean, Henry VIII was once a nice young guy before he became king and had absolute power and started killing all his friends.
That's the one advantage you have over the rabbis. They did not know English history.
Well, they don't need English history. But it's just, speaking of power, I had a interesting conversation with some Arab friends of mine. And I said, all the Israelis I personally know don't even think about the Palestinians as much as they think about Iran. Like Iran is a big, oh my God, something they're afraid of. And they're like, oh my gosh, yes, Iran is causing problems for everybody. They're too powerful, etc. It's like, so there's just some general recognition. Power is scary. That's all. The United States is scary with power and has been scary for a very long time with power. And it was like in elections were manipulated. I bet you there were a whole lot of people in South America saying, ha ha, yeah, karma's a bitch, isn't it? So, it's always a bad thing. It tends to almost always be a bad thing. And that's a universal problem. The anti-Semitism is a particular problem. It's something the Asians will probably get hold of too. Like as far as be a victim of, also the whole thing about punching up instead of punching down. That's how people regard it. So that is a consistent, absolutely terrible problem that we should speak out against. But I don't know a solution apart from speaking out against it when you see it, while still being able to criticize certain figures in Israel.
Rabbi?
Good. All right. So let's now look at the other side. We're on 11A4. The 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth line from on the left.
The verse, Abram, that is Abraham, teaches that Abraham remained in his righteousness from beginning to end.
Okay, so we have a verse that also repeats Abraham's Abraham's name, and therefore we say, guess what? Here's a guy who was good through and through. Okay. To take the moral ambiguity question that's been raised, that doesn't mean that Abraham doesn't do anything bad, but it means that he's a good person through and through, who every once in a while does something bad. The way Achashverosh is looked at is He's a bad person through and through, who every once in a while does something good.
Yeah.
All right.
The verse, that is Aaron and Moses, teaches that Aaron and Moses remained in their righteousness from beginning to end.
Okay.
The verse, and David, he was the youngest, teaches that David remained in his humility from beginning to end, just as he belittled himself in his youth before one who was greater than him in Torah scholarship. So too, when he was king, he belittled himself before one who was greater than him in wisdom.
Okay. So look at number 57 and then 58.
57 from 1 Samuel. The simple meaning of the verse is that David was the youngest of his brothers. However, were this the only meaning of the verse, it would have said he was the youngest of them. The Gemara is therefore prompted to interpret the verse as a reference to David's humility, that according to Maharsha. And 58, before he ascended the throne, David learned Torah from Mephibosheth.
As it says explicitly in the Bible. Not, okay.
When he was king, David was taught 2 matters of wisdom by Achitophel, and as a result, he called Achitophel, my chief and my teacher, and that's apparently discussed in Pirkei Avot 6. And
so this of course brings us back to that figure that was that Jen mentioned before, the very complicated figure of David, and what we have here is the positive projection of an image for David, that David is considered, for all of his charisma, vitality, whatever other things that he does, he's credited with a certain amount of self-awareness. And he is considered to be understanding that I've got certain gifts, but I don't have certain other gifts. Right? So yes, I'm a ladies' man. I'm a military genius. I'm a wonderful composer. There's all kinds of stuff, but I do recognize that there are other people that have greater wisdom than I, or greater Torah study than, obviously, again, this is an anachronism, but it's their way of putting a picture together of a person who is not so full of themselves by all of their really amazing gifts that they don't acknowledge that in significant areas they are lacking, or they are in need of guidance or mentorship by other people. So again, whether this is an accurate picture of the biblical David is not for not for us to judge. It's their construct of that David, but it's something that's useful for us to think about in terms of our own lives and our own experience of other people, because how rare and how difficult it is for people who are blessed with extraordinary gifts to also hold on to some kind of humility. David is this successful, beloved guy who literally gets away with murder. And what they're saying, again, take it with a grain of salt, but what they're saying is, and yet we think that he had this other part of his consciousness. He didn't put himself so completely up on a pedestal that he wasn't aware of his lacking certain accomplishments or certain qualities. We have to also know that he is, even though he's guilty of a terrible sin, he's also on record as being tremendously repentant. There are psalms of repentance. The biblical story when they talk the narrative of David, brings him in a crashing down of repentance. He has those qualities. Back to Achashverosh, since the Megillah is our main supposedly our main subject, Achashverosh, when he never apologizes for allowing Haman to try to destroy all the Jews. He just simply says, well, once I said it's something, I can't take it back, right? Which is the very essence of anti-repentance, right? The whole point of repentance is to try to take something back. What do we start Yom Kippur with? We start Yom Kippur with Kol Nidre. Anything we said, we take it back. Please don't be angry at us if we promise something and we didn't fulfill it, and that's for good, and if we did promise something and it's for bad, we take it back now and we cancel it and so on. Achashverosh is incapable of doing that, right? He says, no, my hands are tied. Those people that were given permission to try to destroy you, I can't stop them. What I can do is I can give you permission to fight back. That's what he says. So Tshuva, which is of the essence of what it means to be a fallible human being, but try to be a good human being, is one thing that's missing in Achashverosh's story as we have it. Okay.
Just one observation. I mean, the virtues of a king are not necessarily the same as the virtues of an ordinary citizen, and we don't always. In the case of David, I mean, David took responsibility for his moral failings regarding Uriah, and we admire him for that, or we empathize with him for that. But acknowledging political or military failings may be different, may not be in the best interest of his political.
So this is an important, like you said, this is a huge concern in statecraft. This plays out all the time. And and Jen knows English history, so she knows that this is going on all the time, among the decisions that people make there. What's good for the monarchy, what's good for the state, what can we admit an error, can we not admit an error? And that happens to this very moment. Things are classified, and nobody should know about the fact that we so totally screwed up in this, that, or the other thing, or we totally mistreated a particular group of people or anything. No, let's hush it up, because in the end it's not, it's not, the state, state interests require that we do this. That's a very, very powerful, long existing tradition. What we see is that it does not guarantee smooth functioning of the government or a good relationship between the society and the ruling authorities. It's a very mixed bag, because it's about getting away with something. And we live in a world now where it's harder and harder to get away with these things. And then the counter argument is, when you'll get people to believe in you, when they believe that you're actually transparent and honest about it. So that's an argument that a lot of people don't buy yet, because they're still very, very invested in the statecraft and state security issues argument. And I don't want to dismiss that argument. I think that there are times when it really is important to keep something secret, because I've sat through board meetings at Shomrei. We can discuss things to death, and if a decision has to be made, thankfully we don't have to make world-shattering life and death decisions. But if you have to get everything out there to be discussed by everybody, you'll never accomplish anything. But I think that more and more that approach of no, let's keep it all classified, is seen as not actually really in the best interest of the state. Jen.
I was just wondering, how do our sages deal with David on his deathbed. Like we have the Godfather Haftarah, you know, where he's still, I mean, and it's probably necessary if he wants Solomon to actually live and not be, you know, not be overthrown, not be assassinated, not be anything else. But that's still a really canny and kind of scary guy. It's not, I mean, maybe he did repent of the murder he committed, but then he's totally willing politically to do some, obviously to do some terrible stuff and have his son do some terrible stuff. Is it just like saying, well, this is statecraft, this is what you have to do for the country? Is it a completely, do we acknowledge in the Talmud that a king should be judged differently than who has like a whole country to worry about than an individual?
There is Talmudic discussion about this. We're not going to get into it today. But the short answer is, and it's again, the short answer is not satisfying because it needs to be, you know, opened up in all of its complexity. But yes, there is a difference between the individual and the state. And the king obviously straddles this, and the king at any particular moment is actually, as I said before about the biblical figures that we were talking about, the king is more than just this particular flesh and blood person. So David's sin is a flesh and blood sin. It wasn't a statecraft sin when with Bathsheba, right? There was another sin that he did when he did a census and so on. That was a statecraft sin, and he comes to God, who gets all angry and says, "God, make it a personal sin. I made that. I own that decision. Punish me. Don't punish the whole people." And that's where he's in this very sticky situation. The 929 people read all about this, where that's this no man's land between when are the decisions personal and when are they, you know, state decisions. But in general, the halakha, the rabbinic perspective of what's right or wrong legally, sees rebellion, trying to do a coup d'état, as a capital offense. If you want to depose the king, then the king can kill you without going through the judicial process that we have in general. For, you know, if you break Shabbos, or if you kill another person, if you kill an individual, you have to have witnesses, you have to be brought to court, and so on. When it comes to security of the state, if somebody is going to try to you know, upend the authorities, they are you know, by any means, they can be stopped by any means. So that's the way they see what was going on over there with David. But there are other Gemaras that are interesting where they criticize David for using military campaigns to deflect from social problems. So they're not totally, you know, oblivious. They're not seeing him as he can do no wrong. He's our, you know, he's the eventual progenitor of the Messiah, but he wasn't the Messiah, you know. Yeah. All right. So here we are. So all of these guys, so just like there are verses that say this is this person and we know that this person is bad through and through, there are good people also that are considered through and through. The Megillah continues.
The Megillah continues. Hamolech, who ruled.
Okay, that's the next that's the next word in the verse, right? So if we had the verse in front of us, it would be Hashverosh, Hu Hachashverosh, Hamolech. So we're just going word for word or phrase by phrase in that first verse. Now the word Hamolech. Go ahead. This is like Rashi, right? When you look at a traditional Chumash or Tanakh or Gemara, you have Rashi's comment that just keeps on going along phrase by phrase, word by word, trying to help us out if there's anything that needs to be explained. This is a little bit more because this is a midrashic. You know, you're not going to see this on the surface of the text. We're going to fill it in a little bit more. Okay.
Rav said, this verse teaches that Ahasuerus ruled of his own accord. That is, he did not inherit the throne by royal descent. Some say that this is praise of Ahasuerus, and others say it is a disparagement of Ahasuerus. Some say that this is a praise of Ahasuerus, for it implies that no one else was as suited for the throne as he was. and others say it is a disparagement of Ahasuerus because it means that he was not really fit for the throne, but paid an excessive sum of money and ascended to the position.
Okay, so here we have the interloper, right? What Rabbi is saying is, why does it say that he ruled? And why does it emphasize that he ruled? Of course, we know that he ruled. He's the emperor. So the idea is his ruling, his ascending to the rulership is special, right? He didn't get this automatically. He wasn't, I think Darius was the previous emperor, and he wasn't the heir to the throne. He gets the throne some other way. And then we have this discussion, how did he get the throne? Was it through a meritocracy situation, or was it through, by hook or by crook? Did he establish his power by acclamation because there was a need to find the best person for the job? There was no heir apparent, or did he connive and get it on his own? So some people praise him and some people don't praise him. Of course, in our world, even the conniving would be the basis for some people praising him. Wow, look at that conniver! What a great shrewd, there's this kind of like realpolitik admiration that some people have. But here we have it as did he deserve it because of qualities that he had or not? Talk about moral ambiguity. So here we have, again, some people, they see him, the guy's a talented guy. The guy could be a very good emperor. And then the question is, does he betray his power? Does he misuse his power or not? Okay.
The Megillah continues. That is Ahasuerus who ruled from Hodu to Cush.
The next phrase.
Rav and Shmuel disputed the meaning of this verse. One said that Hodu was at one end of the world and Cush is at the other end of the world. And thus the verse teaches that Ahasuerus ruled from one end of the world to the other. And one said that Hodu and Cush were adjacent to each other. And the verse teaches the following. Just as he ruled Hodu and Cush, so he ruled from one end of the world to the other.
Okay. So let's see what kind of comments. I'm curious. I haven't looked at this. The comment on the bottom.
Note 60.
The art scroll, the Schottenstein Talmud, is not actually very good at realia. History, realia, geography, those all kinds of irrelevant things to studying the ins and outs of the Talmudic conversation. So I'm curious to see what they say here. So
well, it's interesting. They seem to take sides here.
Go ahead.
Since Hodu and Cush were adjacent to each other, like where does that come from? The intent of the verse cannot be.
Well, this is the assumption. The person who says Hodu and Cush there's a fight. In other words, how do we identify Hodu and Cush? What areas, what regions, what countries are being referred to? So there's a fight here. It's not clear. They're not clear about what is being referred to. We'll get to what theories there are later. But according to one person, Hodu and Cush are countries far away from each other. According to the other person, they're adjacent to each other. So if they're adjacent to each other, then
since Hodu and Cush were adjacent to each other, the intent of the verse cannot be to convey the extent of Ahasuerus' kingdom, because we know that Ahasuerus ruled 127 provinces, which is considerably more than Hodu and Cush. Rather, the verse specifies Hodu and Cush to teach that these countries were typical of his kingdom. That is, Ahasuerus ruled the entire world with the same might and power which he exercised over Hodu and Cush. Maharal and Riaf write that this dispute does not pertain to the geographical locations of Hodu and Cush. All agree that Hodu and Cush were adjacent to each other. Where they get that from is beyond me. Editorial comment, sorry. However, the one who says that Hodu and Cush were at opposite ends of the world takes into account that the whole world lies between them as viewed from the other side of the globe.
Where is it?
So yes, good question. Okay, so obviously, from what we see here, if we don't look at this last paragraph, we don't know, right? We don't know where it is. Scholars today, basically, the geographic terms Hodu and Kush are generally understood to refer to India
And Ethiopia.
and Ethiopia. So they're not exactly adjacent to each other. On the other hand, they're not exactly at different ends of
opposite.
the world. But they do have a kind of a sense of, if we imagine where Persia is, right, then India is a little more to the east, right, and Ethiopia is all the way to the west, right. So you have a stretch of the Middle East, basically the entire Middle East, possibly North Africa, and going into Asia itself. So that's what's understood usually to be Hodu and Kush. What we have here? What do we make of these two interpretations? So one is saying just it's a wow thing. Wow, look at how extensive this empire was, from Hodu to Kush, which is probably the simplest way to understand it, right? From here to there. I mean, it's not, even if it's not the ends of the earth, that's a pretty extensive bit of territory. So that's the wow interpretation. The other interpretation, I would say, if they're adjacent to each other, right? They're right next to each other. And then they're paradigmatic. They're exemplary of what the rest of the community of the empire is. Then what we're saying is the surveillance was so strong that no matter how far flung the possessions of this empire were, the empire had a tight grip everywhere, just as if it was Hodu and Kush. Just like being next to you couldn't avoid the security forces, the apparatus that they had of finding out what was going on wherever it was. So it's not about the physical extent of the empire. It's about the control that the empire had over its possessions. It had everybody. It knew what everybody was doing. It knew where you couldn't console you. Oh, I'm 1,000 miles away from Shushan. What does he know about what I'm doing? Guess what? They know exactly what you're doing, just like you were next door. That's how I would read the statements. Some people had their hands up, so they wanted to say a few things. Who's that? Okay, Sylvia.
Well, it's parallel, but I don't know how many people have read this week's New Yorker, but there is a long article that I glanced at about Nero. And the point being,
come back.
Yeah, exactly. But in a different way, the British Museum is trying to re-understand or understand, in fact, how bad he really was. And the implication is that historians, even at that time, had political views and painted him with a brush that was really far exceeding anything he had actually done. So this is we're talking about Ahasuerus. I mean, it's a question of, I'm sorry?
Nero's problem was that he didn't realize Christianity would eventually become powerful. And that's why he's remembered so awfully. That was his mistake.
That's one way of looking at it. And I realized he took power in 59 AD, which was, he did not live to 70 AD, but it was I just couldn't help but wonder, it was a crumbling Roman Empire at that point, desperate. And
not quite. The crumbling came a couple of hundred years after that, Sylvia, in my understanding.
Nero inherited, he was still like the Rome of Augustus, which was pretty powerful.
He was powerful, but it was politically, apparently it was splitting, and he was accused of things that he probably didn't do, according to the British Museum.
Like stealing elections and stuff like that.
No, killing people and how he killed people and things of
That
that.
was, yeah, we've heard about that also.
And he played the fiddle while Rome burned. Well, the fiddle wasn't invented till the 16th century.
So
You
he
know,
wasn't.
He did
so
not burn Rome. I think we can exonerate him of burning Rome. He was not
right.
burning
Right. But I'm just saying it reminds me in a way of what we're reading about Ahasuerus. You know, he's evil, and there's no question he's bad. But how much did history write into it?
Right. Great. I'm look forward to looking at that article. Thank you.
But history always, I mean, the history is always
History
written
gives
by
things, of course.
the victors. And I mean, all the, if we read Samuel and Kings, there, we have to remember that, you know, the account that we're getting is from the perspective of
winners.
the author, the
What perspective?
Deuteronomistic authors of how do they want to present this history. And I guess there are strands within the book of Samuel about the sort of pro and anti monarchist strands. But yeah, I started that article in the New Yorker and I just thought,
No good?
well, no, I didn't get as far as Sylvia did. It just kind of seemed like, okay, if we're really going to let's try to resuscitate, you know, the most venal and figure that we can find. Just that the historical
that would have been Caligula, though.
the evidence is just so thin that, you know, yeah, all we have is the sources of who wrote about Nero. I mean, I should finish it because I sort of gave up on it.
Because she sort of goes and says, well, basically, what's history going to say about today?
But we know nothing about King David and
Right.
Saul and Solomon except what is in Tanakh. We don't have any other sources that have any information about them. So,
Stuart, just a question for you, Stuart, just out of curiosity, or Sylvia, because you brought up the question of how do you judge somebody via what they're doing in the state as opposed to, you know, is a person judged the same way, a king judged the same way. It's like, what do you do with somebody like Augustus, who was personally brutal and ruthless, but was really good for Rome, and the average person of Rome was way better. I wouldn't have wanted to be someone who was powerful and politically opposed him. But if you were just Joe Schmo in Rome, you were way better off under Augustus, who stopped the wars and got everything organized again, and et cetera, et cetera. Like, so how do you judge that personal ruthlessness against, yeah, you were really good for your country?
Splitting it.
Well, I mean, I think that there are two different kinds of personal foibles. I mean, there's the sort of Bill Clinton problem, you know, pretty good president, maybe not the most wonderful in his private life, but I don't really care about his
like
private
David
life.
Bathsheba and etc. Like was just personal.
You know, or John or whoever. But then when you talk about someone who really is ruthless and is, you know, destroying his political enemies, then you have a different problem.
So how
But
do you
then you end
explain?
up with a stronger country.
Well-
So I don't know what to do with that.
So how do you explain in
You're
Russia
talking about
where?
motivation? You're really talking about intent, motivation, things of that sort, where they lie.
Rich wants to talk.
Yeah.
So taking that to a more extreme level, you got people in Russia who would love to have Stalin back because there was law and there was order, and you know, they didn't have to worry about things.
Well,
True. I mean,
I think
Augustus wasn't
Well,
Stalin. But yeah.
How about the Russian aristocracy? I mean, that was
Right.
life was calm for the common people in ways.
I think Jen's point is that in her judgment and in other people's judgment, Augustus was good for the country, good for the empire. It's very hard to argue that Stalin was good for everybody.
Right.
The reason, unfortunately, it's a sad and tragic reality that Stalin still has, support to this day, and Putin is, today's Stalin in many ways, is because people idolize. They worship power. They worship strongmen. I said before, half jokingly, well, the conniving gets admiration from some people. It really does. Unfortunately, people are abjectly, some people are abjectly enthralled to the strong man, and it just gives them gives them such inspiration, and there's no moral qualms or qualifications at all in their judgments. and there's no reality check. They're not really talking about that it's all better for the country. They just have this concept that anything else scares the heck out of me. So I'd rather just have this gorilla in power. Yeah, Bill.
It's Rabbi. It's from what I know about the Soviet Union, because I taught about it for a long time. It's beyond just individual people preferring this or that. The idea of a vozhd, of a strong leader, is deeply embedded in Russian
that
culture.
That culture is yes.
Where it came from, I don't know. It may go back to the time of troubles. I don't know. On the other side of the vozhd is not what we would call democracy, but what they call anarchy, complete breakdown of all social order. They don't seem, and the history of Russia since the fall of communism seems to bear this out, they don't seem to have the ability to function in between those two poles. There's either the vozhd, who keeps everything in order, regardless of the destruction and all the rest of that, whether he's Ivan the Terrible or Joseph Stalin. And on the other hand, there's the end of everything, utter and complete chaos. They don't seem to be able to manage anything in between. It's tough to be Russian.
Right. I would take the word ability out and put in conceive. They can't conceive of alternatives.
Okay.
The culture, I think is super correct. The culture has been created that has this kind of like really amoral, or in my sense, immoral perspective that judges everything according to what you're saying. It's either somebody's in charge or else it's chaos. And
chaos.
And it's totally anti-democratic, and it can't conceive. There's no conception of that possibility of going in a different direction. I want to just share it. I mean, it was so sad for me. I mean, one of the things that bring it back to our people, the huge influx of people from this former Soviet Union into Israel brought in a huge population of people who don't have that kind of democratic culture in their history, in their education, in their perspective. And I was reading a while back. It's now, it was I think the 25th anniversary of Rabin's murder, Rabin's assassination, so, which is a time of deep tragedy for the Jewish people, and we brought it on ourselves. And the article was about how Russian Israelis don't get why there is mourning in Israel over Rabin to this day.
Wow.
They just get over it. That's the way the world works. People have power, and then somebody else takes the power away from them, and then this one gets in trouble, so this one gets assassinated. They live with assassinations every day of the week in Russia. So they shrug it off as being like so not of concern to anybody. Why would you waste your emotions on this kind of thing? To me, it was such a depressing report about how people see the world. And you're not going to convince anybody. I don't know how you do it. It's going to take forever and ever and ever to move people's consciousness away from that way of looking at things.
The sad news, again, from what little bit I know from teaching about this stuff, is that there's no evidence in history that anybody has ever changed anybody else's mind on a mass scale. So when Nazism basically, now everything is different in Germany now, basically was wiped out, the people who were Nazis didn't suddenly become non-Nazis. They were Nazis until the day that they died. But the good news is they died, and they were replaced by people who weren't Nazis. And the German educational system, which was already in place in 1965 when I first started studying this stuff, changed nobody's mind, but they educated the new minds in an anti-Nazi and democratic way. So in 1965, when I first started graduate school, Germany was a democratic country only in name. Voting was a Pflicht, a duty of the citizen. There was no commitment to it and so forth. But within a generation, when most of those people had died and a new generation came out of the German educational system, for my money, it's the most democratic country in the world. The most responsible.
So which I like to do, let's take that back into our own story, right? That's in the end what's going to happen as we read the rest of the Torah story. A whole generation is going to have to die out in order for another generation of Israelites to be capable, to use your word, able to actually conceive of going into the land.
And the good news is with appropriate leadership, whether educational or political, it is possible for that to be accomplished. It's not guaranteed.
That's the big if.
God help us. It's not guaranteed, but it is possible. At least it's possible.
Right. Without short of a world war, how do you make that cataclysmic change?
Yeah. Well,
Josie and then Jen.
Yeah, I was going to ask whether you see that same pattern among the younger generation of Jews whose families emigrated from the Soviet Union. Are they still in the same mindset, the younger generation?
Less. It may take another generation, but as they're raised in Israel, go to Israeli schools, serve in the Israeli army.
They may change.
They will be raised with a different mindset.
Well,
they still have the stories from their grandparents, and so that'll be part of their mental universe, but they will live in a different world.
Unfortunately, to put a little bit of a kibosh on Bill's very hopeful statement.
Yeah, I tend to be a cockeyed optimist.
Right, which is a good thing. What we see actually is that Israeli youth is becoming more and more and more conservative and right wing and anti-democratic.
Yeah.
Because they are prey to, like you say, the educational system, the zeitgeist, the realities all around them. They're in a very, very hard place. And because the leadership is not a leadership, a Martin Luther King type leadership or something like that.
Or a Konrad Adenauer type leadership.
Right. They don't have those leaders anymore. When I said the Rabbi, he exemplified what it meant to change your mind and say, no, we got to go a different way. And he paid for it with his life. And the people that cut him down have been on the ascendancy for over a generation. I mean, even the new government did they get sworn in yet today?
I don't know. I think they were going to get sworn in on Sunday. Yeah, it should be done by now, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know what the results were.
So the chances are that this new government will come in. The new government is completely right wing. I mean, obviously there are a few left wing, parties that have joined in, and that are going to try to make the best of it. But the leadership, Naftali Bennett is as right wing as you can get. So,
is it not heartening that all these people hate Netanyahu more than they hate each other? I mean, it's pretty.
I don't know.
It's pretty amazing.
You know what? That doesn't hearten me. I'm sorry. That's personal. That goes back to your question before. Where are we talking? When are we talking statecraft? When are we talking values? And when are we talking?
Right. And the problem with Netanyahu was he was just so corrupt and so autocratic that they said enough is enough. I mean, I think ultimately he's out not because of his policies, but because of his character and his,
And he's an example of a guy who I certainly reject and despise. But over the years, people have pointed out that he actually was less extreme than the supporters that he drummed up and that he incited to come to his defense. He was less extreme in terms of military matters. He was less extreme in terms of social issues. He was maybe a little bit of an Achashverosh type.
He wanted power. He wanted
power. No guiding principles.
He's the one who reached out to the joint list.
But isn't he the one who's kept the ultra Orthodox in power? Do they get less power with this new?
Now they have less power this time. Yes.
So to me, like I might actually be recognized as a real Jew in Israel who could get buried there.
Don't hold your breath.
Don't hold.
Don't quit the daytime just yet. The bad news is that even the Arab Party, which for the first time since 1948 is now a part of the government, although they don't have any ministry, even they're extremely right wing.
Right.
They're not the lefty socialist Arabs.
Right. And this is that God is laughing.
He's having a great time
At how messed up this whole business.
But look at the so-called Western world. It's in lots of countries are in a similar situation.
Yeah.
It seems to be the mode of the times.
We're in what the Chinese called interesting times.
Indeed.
It's not be so
Exactly.
interesting.
Exactly.
Right. All right, let's go a little further.
Okay.
So
A similar
now
case.
we're at a similar case,
Top
11,
right.
day 4,
Top right column.
top right column.
First full paragraph. A similar case is as follows. For he, King Solomon, had dominion over all this side of the river, from Tifsach to Azah. Rav and Samuel disputed the meaning of this verse. One said that Tifsach was at one end of the world and Azah was at the other end of the world, and one said that Tifsach and Azah were adjacent to each other. And the verse teaches that just as he ruled Tifsach and Azah, so he ruled the entire world.
Okay. So just a little footnote. That second way of looking at things, that the kind of power that was being exerted by the government over all of the dominion was a strong arm kind of power. That actually is accurate for Solomon. Solomon created a pretty totalitarian political regime and controlled Jewish society and all of the possessions that he had with an iron hand. So, even though he was supposed to be so wise and we have all these wonderful stories about him, as a monarch, he brings about the disaster of the splitting of the North and the South. He starts the ball rolling because he starts all of his policies. He conscripts people, forces
National Forced Labor, corvée.
He's creating this brewing resentment and this disconnect between the people and the powerful center. I mean, that was his whole point. He was supposed to be the fulfillment of the Deuteronomic vision: one center, one temple, unifying the entire people. And the irony is that the more he created that unified center, the more he was pushing people apart. So very sad. Okay, we continue.
The Megillah continues. 127 provinces.
That's the next phrase in that same sentence.
Rav Chisda said that the three numbers mentioned in the verse, 100, 20, and 7, intimate the following. In the beginning of Ahasuerus's reign, he ruled over 7 provinces. Later, he ruled over an additional 20 provinces, and later still, he ruled over an additional 100 provinces.
Okay, so gradually he's getting more and more successful, more and more powerful. Okay, that's why it says, these numbers one by one by one.
The Gemara challenges this form of interpretation. But now that you maintain that one can divide a number in this fashion, how will you explain the verse, and the years of the life of Amram were 137 years? Since no exposition is evident in that case, it would seem that this form of interpretation is invalid. Huh? The Gemara answers, the case here is different because the segment of the verse under discussion is superfluous. Since it has already been mentioned that Ahasuerus ruled from Hodu to Cush, why do I need the verse to add that he ruled 27 provinces? Learn from this that this segment is written for the purposes of interpretation.
Okay. So the answer, of course, is there's some textual peculiarity that makes the interpretation welcome and possibly even necessary. Anybody have a recollection of another 127 number anywhere? Yeah, Bill.
Sarah's life.
Right. So Sarah's life is also 127 years. And there we also do this kind of parsing. We talk about the 7 and the 20 and the 100. So what's the textual peculiarity over there that warrants this? After all, they're saying, look, you got to mention the names. You got to mention the names, the numbers, right? 137. What was Amram's life? 137, right?
Seven.
So you mentioned the life, you mentioned the numbers of states that or provinces. You got to mention the numbers themselves. You know, when I write checks, you know, I write, you know, 100 and zero
Yeah.
zeros, you know,
Or whatever.
100, right? You know, so
Yeah.
you can't get away from it. You got to write it out. So the peculiarity with Amram, there is no peculiarity. It says 137, so there's nothing to say, right? In the Achashverosh verse, the peculiarity is we already said that this is extensive. He's an emperor all over the entire world. So what do you need to say? Oh, and it's 127. We know that that's how many there, you know, members of the UN there are. What about with Sarah? With Sarah, the word year keeps on being repeated. It says and this is the life of Sarah. She lived 100 years and 20 years and 7 years.
Yes.
So the word years, instead of saying she lived 127 years, it says years and years and years.
And years.
So each of the numbers is broken up and separated by the word years. So that's the peculiarity that brings the sages to explain that she was, you know, in her old age, she was just as innocent as when she was 7. She was just as beautiful as when she was 20, you know, and she was just as wise, you know, at 100, and when she was 7, she, you know, like all of these different kinds of stages of life are seen as exemplary of particular qualities that Sarah had. But it needs that grain of sand to create the pearl, right? It needs that little irritation in the verse in order to create the interpretation. All right, here we go. More.
Change of pace. The rabbis taught in a Baraita, 3 kings ruled the entire world. They are Ahab, Achashverosh, and Nebuchadnezzar. The Gemara gives the scriptural sources. Ahab ruled the entire world, as it is written, as Hashem your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent to look for you, etc.
Okay,
Now, if Ahab,
what's that situation? Did they explain it? 65.
65 from 1 Kings. Obadiah told the prophet Elijah that King Ahab had searched for Elijah in every nation of his kingdom. The verse continues, and they said, he is not here. And he made his kingdom and nations swear that they could not find you. According to Masorat Shas and Ein Yaakov, this part of the verse is also quoted in the text. The Gemara's proof that follows is derived from this latter argument.
Okay, or the idea that you know this verse by heart. So if I cite the beginning of the verse, and you know the end of the verse.
Yeah,
but the point is that Ahab are trying to kill Elijah. So they're searching for him, and he's hiding because they've already killed over 100 prophets of God, and he's like a holdout, and he's of course the biggest figure of them all. At least that's who gets to the history told about him. So this shows that Ahab had such an extensive kingdom that it went all over the globe.
I just have one comment or question about that. I mean, we know as moderns that there are no more continents to discover, that there are no nations that we don't know about. There might be some tribe somewhere in the Amazon or something that we haven't fully had contact with, but it just seems like in the ancient world, they must have had a sense that there might be parts of the world that they don't really know about. Right? I mean, the European explorations hadn't occurred yet. They must have had some sense of that.
Right.
Not really, Stuart.
No, maybe not.
They knew the landmass of the Middle East, obviously. They knew Greece. They knew Africa, at least North Africa. They knew as far as India. I don't know that anybody then had any idea that there was a China or a Tibet or a Japan or
The Romans had the
islands.
silk trade. Romans had silk trade with China. So yeah, it existed. Plus, but from ancient Greek times, they knew how big the world was. Just by measuring shadows, they figured out how large the world was, and they did a very, very near bit of accuracy. So they knew they could account for all, so they might have known that, there could be other lands in between.
If you look at maps there, it says, the known world, and then there's sort of terra incognito. They had a sense that there was something beyond their vision, but
Yeah,
they just didn't know what was there.
monsters. There
Where
be
you
there
fall
be
off the
monsters.
cliff, where you fall off the
Yeah,
edge.
they even knew it was a globe. I mean, they knew, so it's not, they did have a lot of knowledge. I mean, somebody must have thought, oh, maybe there's more land.
So I think the more pertinent answer is that we all have senses of everybody knows blah, blah, blah. When we say everybody knows, right? Or everybody, says Ashrei with this tune, right? We're talking about our sphere of experience. And that's all that counts. We're discovering, forget about the fact that we know that there are no more continents. We're discovering that there are people in our own neighborhoods that we haven't looked at. So we see what we want to see, and that's what counts. And that's the whole world. That's the whole society. That's the whole reality. It's whatever it is that means something to us. So yes, so for when they're using these kinds of big, gigantic generalizations, that's what they're really talking about, right? When Alexander ruled the whole world that counts. Okay. You know what? We're going to stop here. Just to finish those last few words, the last few lines that on the top of the right-hand side.
Now, if Ahab did not rule over them, how could he have made them swear? This proves that Ahab ruled every nation in the world.
QED.
QED, indeed.
All right.
Yasher
So
Koach.
looking forward to next time. Zeigazint, everybody.
Zeigazint, stay safe, everybody.